Okay, now let's start again. Now, if you recall, I said we have to find some method of allocating this overhead to these finished goods. Remember, the overhead incurred in an entire period can be only accurately known at the end of the period, whereas we can estimate this from previous year's experience. So maybe we can by some method estimate what is there. And now there are a few things about overheads that you need to know. Overheads are not necessarily all fixed. They are called semi-variable costs. They vary in a different proportion, but with a fixed component being there all the time. Okay, now let's see, how do you estimate? Let's say you got some past experience and past information about how overhead happened in the previous years. Always remember, the overhead is the result of some primary activity. Maybe it is because you are having labor force, and because of the labor force you have got some overhead. The overhead drives the labor force drives the overhead, or the labor force creates the overheads to be there. So let's assume for the time being the labor force is the creator or the driver for the overhead. If that be the case, then you say the overheads are driven by this, or the cost driver for this overhead is the labor. Now, as I told you before, the overheads can be semi-variable. Now take a look at this example that I have got from a web. Now this is the high-low method. Now that's the web address. You can check a look. Here's an example. Now in this case it's not labor force. Maybe units are, in this case, let's see, a number of units being produced. That's a factory overhead incurred for each month. This is in the past what has happened for each level of units of production. In other words, this is the driver for this overhead. Now how do we predict for different level of activity what the overhead could be? Make sense? And there are two parts to that. As I told you before, because they are semi-variable, this relationship is semi-variable, there could be a variable cost per unit and a fixed cost. How do you find that out? And this is done by what is called the high-low method. So what do? We find the highest, in these units, these are the driver, pick the highest value in this. In this case, if you go through here, that is the highest value. Look at that, that's the highest value. Then pick the lowest value here, that's the lowest value. See, the highest, that's a driver, 3,000. The lowest is 1,250. So now you identify that's your highest. What is the corresponding factory overhead for that? In this case, that's the highest, that's your corresponding factory overhead. Similarly, that's your lowest, 1,250 is the lowest driver, and the corresponding value is 38,000. Now, to find out the variable quantity, you subtract the 59,000 from 38,000. Yes, that's the difference between the ordinate, the y highest minus the y lowest. That difference is divided by the gap, this x highest minus the x lowest, and that will give you the rate, $12 per unit. In other words, for every unit of manufacture, you're estimated to have $12 of overhead. Now you have to find out the fixed component. How do you do that? Is you substitute into one of these numbers. Say, let's go up here. Now the formula we're going to use is y equals, that's the formula. I'll show you the formula for this. That's the formula we are trying to do. Y is the dependent variable or the factory overhead. Y. X is the independent variable, which is the cost driver. Okay, so you put into one of those values. So we put in here the amount I'm talking about is $12 per unit. You put into that value when into 159, where 59,000 sits. So when y is equal to 59,000, b is $12 per unit, x is how much was that? X was 3,000. You work it out. You get a value for A is a fixed quantity, and the fixed quantity in this case will work out to be 23,000. So the formula that you would use is y equals 23,000 plus the 12 is the a b part of it, and x is the independent variable or the units that we manufacture. Having found that, if I ask you what is the value for factory overheads when, say, for 2,000 units, and you put in 2,000 there, is 2,000 times 12 is 24,000 plus 23,000 will be 47,000 will be the factory overhead, estimated factory overhead for 2,000 units. Make sense? That will give you some idea as to how to use high-low method. If you wish to take note of this URL, go up there and have a read through that, and that will give you some idea about how it should be done. Otherwise, go to the textbook, or you can ask me. Okay, bye bye.